Hello, we are on the back porch talking higher education. My name is Christine Daynes. I am joined by the host of this podcast series, my spouse and business partner, Dr. Gary Daynes. Gary, welcome.
Christine, thank you. It's great to be with you.
In the previous podcast, you talked about the practices of large universities that small colleges should not follow. Essentially, you described how small colleges could stay small and thrive. Tell us more about why small colleges should be committed to staying small.
Christine, I think there are two main reasons. One of them is that you have to acknowledge the constraints of the real world. And with the declining number of students going to college and declining trust in the value of a higher education, those are real constraints. It would make it harder for a small school to get bigger. It's also the case that small schools have lots of internal constraints. They may not have enough resources to grow rapidly. They may not have enough staff to grow rapidly. They may have staff who are doing 3 or 4 jobs at the same time. So I think it's just important for a small school to acknowledge the real world that it lives in. But the second reason, and perhaps the more attractive reason, is that by committing to staying small, it allows small schools the possibility of focusing on excellence and distinctiveness. And that sort of excellence and distinctiveness aren't necessarily available to those schools if they are dedicated to growing for growth's sake.
But you would think that large scale and large resources would be more likely to make it possible to be excellent and distinctive. How does being small provide potential for distinctiveness and excellence?
Well, let me use an analogy from outside of the world of education for a minute. If you want to buy something that is inexpensive and mass-produced, whether it's a loaf of bread or a can of beer or a t-shirt, the place to go for it is a massive retailer. If you want to buy something that is unusual, that's handmade, that really is good, if you want a great loaf of bread or an interesting can of craft beer, you're not going to go to a massive retailer. You're going to go to a small entity that makes those things with care and focus. And that's the place where you're going to get the excellent distinctive thing. So I think the same thing is true in higher education. If you want something that's inexpensive and mass-produced, you can get it at a big university. If you want something that is attuned to you, that is distinctive, that's excellent, that's the analogy to a loaf of bread cooked at an artisan bakery, then you should go to a small school.
So how would a small school discover what should be its points of excellence and distinctiveness?
That's a great question, and you might think that a small school would just by its nature know what those things are, but it's not always the case. So there are 3 practices that I would recommend that small schools take up to help them discover what their points of excellence and distinctiveness should be. So the first of them is they need to look closely at their core commitments. And by this I mean the mission, vision, and values of the school. Most of the time, schools only look at their mission, and most mission statements are sort of common, right? We're a school, we help people learn stuff. But if you look more closely at the vision and the values, that's where you will find evidence of real distinctiveness. So anyway, that's one thing you can do, look closely at the core commitments. A second thing is to be honest about what you're actually good at. And the things that you're good at may be things like you have a fabulous philosophy program, or you've got great internships, or you are really good at helping students solve problems, right? But most schools don't know what they're actually good at because they've been trying to be decent at a whole bunch of things instead of being great at a handful of things. So a certain measure of honesty is essential. And the third thing I would say is you have to be honest about who your students are and what your students actually need and seek. Too often, small schools either have students that are wildly different from each other, or they're unwilling to acknowledge that their students are, for instance, mostly local, or they struggle with mathematics, or their goal is to open small businesses. And by not acknowledging who their students are and what they want, they end up offering all sorts of things to students that students don't find attractive and that aren't actually all that good. So I think just some honesty about your core commitments, about what you're already good at, and about who your students are and what they seek is the pathway towards finding things that allow you to be excellent and distinctive.
It occurs to me, none of the things you just described are things that require a comparison to other schools to understand. Mission, institutional strengths, student characteristics and needs. These are all things institutions already know.
That's right. And it doesn't hurt to look at what other schools are doing, but you should look at it as a point of comparison, not as a point of desire or jealousy. Be comfortable with who you are.
So because schools already know these things about themselves, what keeps them from responding in ways that are, as you say, distinctive and excellent?
Again, a couple of things. One is, while some people may know the answers to those questions, not everybody has the same answer to the same questions. So your faculty might think that the philosophy program is fantastic, when in fact students think that it's the business program that's fantastic. So there's a sort of misalignment there between self-understanding of the institution and the understanding of students. But I think more importantly, it's not always the case that those things, core commitments for instance, are pushed down throughout the organization. It's not always the case, for instance, that, I'll pick an office, the business office puts forward the same values as student advising or as the institutional advancement office. So there's inconsistency inside schools, and you would expect that, right? If a school has been around for 150 years, it's got leftovers and layers of all sorts of different things. So being honest about those areas then really will require an organization to try to develop institution-wide consistency, both in answering those questions and then in delivering the services that line up with the answers to those questions.
What are practical ways to move towards excellence and distinctiveness?
Let me just mention two really quickly. One of them is to keep the things that you are good at and find different ways to do the things that you aren't good at, or where you're not excellent, or where you're not distinctive. And there are all sorts of different ways that you can provide those things, right? You could outsource them. You could use shared services with another institution. You could have people with different skills doing that work. But it's really important to direct your resources towards the things where you are excellent and distinctive, and to find less expensive, better, more efficient ways to do the other things. So that leads to my second point here. Every time you allocate budget resources, you've got to allocate them around two things. One is the points of excellence and distinctives, and the other is about acknowledging the constraints in the real world. If you have a budget that imagines that you're just going to magically grow, or if you have a budget that directs most of its resources to things that aren't distinctive or excellent, then your budget is pointing in the wrong direction. Schools make these sorts of decisions every single year, and it's in those decisions about allocating resources that you can see the reality of a school's commitment to excellence and distinctive, and therefore to being small and successful.
Thank you, Gary. These are terrific insights and ideas. Thanks for sharing your expertise.
My pleasure. Happy to be with you today.
If listeners are interested in these ideas, they can learn more from the blog at backporchconsulting.net, or you can read Gary's book. It is called How to Be a Small College, and it is available from the Back Porch Consulting website or Amazon. We have been on the Back Porch talking higher education. Listeners, please subscribe and continue to join us in work that enlivens small colleges.